Uh, we cannot hear you. Could you please?
Oh,
yes, now it's
well,
okay.
thank you. I'm a little bit unfamiliar with the system here, but I think it's my turn to start, and I'm very honored that you folks invited me to participate in your conference. I've been following the evolution of Latvia's whistleblower law for several years. I think it's a very exciting development. My topic this morning is boosting employee confidence in your whistleblower law. And I think the most significant thing to start that is to understand whose confidence you want to boost. Who are whistleblowers? What's moving them? And if we understand them better, we can help to work with them more effectively. There's no particular type of person who's a whistleblower. I've worked with over 7,000 in the last 40 years. And some of them are inspirational role models. Others of them are people who've been fighting with folks all their lives, and they finally found something to be self-righteous about. And most of them are neither. But all of them are people at the intersection of valid but competing values that we've all been raised with. For example, we're raised that it's good to be a team player and to be cooperative. And we don't respect naysayers. People that say, no, we can't do that. But on the other hand, we respect people for being rugged individualists. We don't have much respect for bureaucratic sheep. People who just go along, don't speak their own minds, don't think for themselves. We've all been raised that it's improper to be a tattletale, to squeal on our friends, to turn people in who are part of our community. But on the other hand, we don't have much respect for people who just look the other way, who don't want to get involved. In the United States, one of our worst tragedies and shames was when a woman was raped on the streets of New York City and everybody closed their windows. In fact, we say that see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. That's a monkey. It's not even a human being. But if you are a tattletale, you're a rat. Well, it's a tough choice that whistleblowers find themselves in. Am I going to be a monkey or a rat? We very much cherish the right to privacy, and whistleblowing challenges the privacy of their targets. But in a democracy, we have to have the public's right to know. We have a choice there. The most difficult choice for whistleblowers is loyalty. Loyalty to whom? Your first loyalty we're all raised with is to support your families. That's why you don't bite the hand that feeds you. You may not be able to support those who depend on you. And you want to be loyal to your coworkers. They're your community. You may spend more time with them than your family. Your whistleblowing may threaten their jobs. But what about loyalty to your community? The neighbors whose children might be threatened by contaminated meat or poultry? Or what about loyalty to the law? You may be liable as a co-conspirator if you join the cover-up. That's something you're aware of. And what about loyalty to your country? Many of the whistleblowers I've worked with have been motivated because they knew that our troops weren't being killed by the enemy. They were being killed by corruption in U.S. defense contractors who put in shoddy parts. Well, whistleblowers have to choose between these. And so why did they choose to stick their necks out? Why did they choose to risk retaliation instead of playing it safe? Whether they're managers or maintenance workers, whether they're conservatives or liberals, I've found there's one common thing with whistleblowers, is they have to act on their knowledge to be true to themselves. If they don't, it'll be like a cancer eating at their souls. Regardless of what their motives were, they always wonder, what if I had acted on the information that I knew? And they are driven to follow through on their knowledge. And most of them are not doing this to be dissidents. Most of them, you know, there's a lot of people, we think of whistleblowing as filing allegations, and that's going to be connected with one of my recommendations. Most whistleblowers are just doing it to honor their identities, to be true to themselves. As they've said to me, you know, one said to me, I have to look myself in the mirror every day the rest of my life when I'm shaving. I want to be able to. Their professional lives are grounded in a set of values and principles, and they're being true to their calling and to their role in society by blowing the whistle. And that's why, as we'll see in the recommendations, a whistleblower law has to include what we call duty speech, protection for those who are communicating protected information, but not as a formal allegation, but rather as part of their responsibilities to do their job properly. Well, that's a little bit of background on who are whistleblowers. Why should organizational leaders, what can organizational leaders do to boost confidence in whistleblower systems? And the first thing is to produce results making a difference. Every survey of whistleblowers who chose to remain silent observers, the primary reason was that they didn't think it would make a difference. Most people are willing to risk retaliation. Most people are, you know, they're courageous. They're willing to fight and die for their country. But there's got to be a point to it. So they have to know that if they stick their neck out, if they expose corruption or abuse of power, that it's going to have some impact. And so a track record of results for any organization is what's going to increase the flow of information to organizational leaders. And that's the second cornerstone, leadership. Leadership, not just in sending out a memo, but leadership in holding town meetings and speaking at them. Leadership in having an open door. Leadership in welcoming disclosures. Leadership in participating in the trainings. Leadership in terms of what I view as the best approach is non-financial reinforced commendations, giving people speak up awards, corporate citizenship awards, letting the workplace, the environment, the people who are making up the culture of the organization to know that whistleblowing is welcomed. It's not perceived as a threat. It's perceived as a resource to contribute to the organization's mission. And that has to come from the top, and it comes through deeds, not just through a memo or a policy. The third thing is an internal system that puts the rules where the rhetoric is, like put your money where your mouth is, put the actual structure and rules of the internal whistleblower channels to reflect the principles and ideals of the internal system. That means, and we'll go into it more in recommendations, but that means freedom from conflict of interest, adequate resources, training for the people staffing that whistleblower channel, a clear channel of communications to the top of the organization rather than being buried in the organization's bureaucracy. And then the fourth, of course, is results in achieving protection, results in canceling retaliation. If the internal system actually reverses some of the harassment that occurred on the more localized level of the organization, people have more faith in the organization as a whole and say, well, this was just a problem with an individual, and I can trust the system here. That's sort of the four cornerstones of how to make a difference more effectively. Well, why should an organizational leader do this? On the corporate level, it's because it's good business. Most whistleblowers, when they make their reports or disclosures, they're not actually exercising the freedom to protest. They're exercising the freedom to warn, to prevent avoidable consequences that could be disastrous for the organization or its mission. And that means they are invaluable resource for organizational leaders. If they're not getting that flow of information and those warnings, they're not even going to know about things that threaten their institution until it's too late and they're being blamed for something they were blindsided for, that nobody gave them advance warning for. They need whistleblowers. I think of, it may be unpleasant to hear it, but I think of an organizational leader's approach to whistleblowers. It's like taking the bitter pill that keeps you out of the hospital. It may be unpleasant, there may be some side effects, but in the long run, organizational leaders who listen to whistleblowers, they're planning for the long run. They're being more farsighted, and their organizations are going to do better. But don't just take my word for it. There's been many studies on this. For example, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a global study about a little over a decade ago. That study found that there was a serious problem of fraud within corporations, people stealing from their employers, and that whistleblowers through anonymous hotlines were responsible to catch and expose and catch more fraud against the companies than internal compliance departments, audit departments, and law enforcement combined. This is the most valuable resource that an organization has. The International Association of Certified Fraud Auditors came out with identical findings about 3 years later. Last year, Professor Kyle Welch of George Washington University did a study of multinational corporations. The corporations that had effective internal whistleblower channels systems, they had less actions by the government against them for enforcement. They had lower penalties when there were actions by the government. They had fewer lawsuits filed against them. And fourth, they settled them more quickly at much reduced rates compared to those who did not have whistleblower programs. Whistleblowers will help you make money in the long run. And it's not just in the corporate world either. It's in society. Whistleblowers, in my experience, have changed the course of history more than I'd ever dreamed of. Let me give you a few examples from US whistleblowers. Our False Claims Act, which Amit can speak from experience, he was a frontlines lawyer for it. It's America's most effective anti-corruption statute. In 1986, before we effectively deputized the whistleblowers, it was bringing in about $10 million a year in civil fraud recoveries for government contracts. It's its scope. Now with deputizing the whistleblowers to file whistleblower lawsuits, it's bringing in over $1.5 billion per year on the average over the last 30 years. And it's getting better and better. It's been over $3 to $5 billion in most recent years. Whistleblowers work. But let's go to other things. Dangerous drugs, dangerous prescription drugs. Thanks to a whistleblower, we got the killer painkiller Vioxx pulled from the US market after it had killed 50,000 Americans with needless heart attacks. It would have kept killing them if it weren't for a whistleblower who got it stopped in 2007. Domestic surveillance. Mr. Snowden is exiled, but thanks to him and half a dozen pioneer whistleblowers who didn't leak classified information, we know that the US had a blanket illegal domestic surveillance program. And thanks to their courage, we got the USA Freedom Act that outlawed snooping on our citizens. Climate change. They ended the censorship of climate change in the United States government. Anti-terrorism. A whistleblower stopped a more ambitious rerun of 9/11. Robert McClain is his name, a federal air marshal, when the US Air Marshal Service was going to go AWOL, abandon its post during the Al-Qaeda attack. Thanks to him, they were not able to abandon their post and the attack was prevented. It was planned to be more ambitious than 9/11. Or military casualties. Thanks to corruption, our Pentagon, our Department of Defense, was not delivering vehicles that could defend troops against landmines in Afghanistan and in Iraq. That's where 60% of our casualties and 90% of our fatalities were occurring, was from landmines for our troops. Thanks to a whistleblower, The effective vehicles, they called them MRAPs, heavily armored vehicles, were freed up and delivered, and the casualties went from 60% to 5%. Or toxic incinerators. Uh, uh, Toxic incinerators, we have incinerators burning industrial waste in our country that were near churches, schoolyards, in minority neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. The company said that they were only burning safe materials. It turned out, thanks to a whistleblower, we learned that they were burning arsenic, lead, mercury, heavy metals, even dioxin, a substance that made Agent Orange in Vietnam and caused all the genetic mutations. They were burning that next to poor neighborhoods. Thanks to a whistleblower, those incinerators were shut down. Nuclear power plants that were accidents waiting to happen were stopped by whistleblowers when they were violating all the safety rules, and could have been worse than Chernobyl. Human rights violations until a whistleblower intervened. U.S. customs agents were regularly stopping people who entered our country and accusing them of drug smuggling without evidence. And if they didn't find that in their luggage, they would do body cavity searches, where you search inside all the sections of a person's body. And then if they didn't find them, they'd send them to the hospital for laboratory tests for up to 4 days, during which time they couldn't contact a lawyer, know the charges against them. It was like their bodies were properties of the US government. Thanks to a whistleblower, 4 days was shrunk to 2 hours before they get the normal rights of citizenship. COVID-19, whistleblowers cleaned up the airports in the United States, which were the major source of the initial wave in our country. But not anymore, thanks to whistleblowers who exposed that and got it cleaned up. Whistleblowers prevented us from mass distributing malaria drugs and to all the people in New Jersey and New York. It cost Dr. Bright his job, but how many tens of thousands of lives did he save? Whistleblowers have stopped the US from deregulating, setting up corporate honor systems for meat and poultry inspection of government approved food 6 times in our country. Or else we'd be liable to have a lot of E. coli and salmonella. Folks, I can keep going on, but whether it's the private sector or the public sector, whistleblowers, whether it's doing their jobs honestly or exposing abuses of power to the government, these are the people who change the course of history, and it's consistently for the better. I'd like to close just for a few minutes, having given a pep talk for the role of whistleblowers in society and what they need and why we need them. A little bit of an overview on Latvia's law. I've just been finishing a project with the International Bar Association to evaluate all the whistleblower laws in the world. All the national whistleblower laws in the world. There's 48 of them currently, and we've reviewed Latvia's laws as part of that process. And I'm pleased to say Latvia finished 7th out of 48 whistleblower laws in terms of the 20 best practice criteria that we assessed the laws for. I'd like to give you credit for some of the good things that were in that law, that are in your law, because they're impressive. It's got a very broad scope of protected speech. People can blow the whistle on what they need to. It's got a very wide scope of audiences, whether it's inside the organization or public freedom of expression. It's got provisions protecting the law against gag orders that would contradict it. This law is the supreme authority when there's a whistleblowing dispute. It's got, with the state chancery, very detailed institutional structure to turn these rights into reality. And that's what it takes, taking root within the government organizations. It's got excellent protection for identities. It's got a reverse burden of proof, which makes even rules of the game. Legal aid, so people can afford to act on their rights. Interim relief, so they can be functional while the cases may drag out for years. It shields whistleblowers against criminal and civil liability. That's better than the US law, which only covers employment context. It has effective remedies to make people whole, not to be worse off if they win than before retaliation, if they win their case. That's 10 examples of very solid positive developments about your law. I would like to make quickly 6 recommendations, though, for how this can actually achieve best practices in global whistleblower rights. The first is you have to, I shouldn't say have to, I'd recommend that you protect all lawful communications of protected information. The law is structured that you don't have any rights unless you make a formal allegation of misconduct following particular procedures. Well, that's just not the way people behave naturally. And if you're going to only have the law relevant for the people who make official disclosures following all the rules and procedures, you're only going to be relevant for the tip of information that you want this law to expose, and you're going to be missing out on the iceberg. It has to cover those who are disclosing protected information as part of their job duties, or in any dialogue within the chain of command, such as memoranda or dialogues with their supervisors, protest at meetings. This would be illegal if we did this. What are the consequences we have to consider? That's essential, and it's my top recommendation. The law, secondly, needs to assist protect all those who assist or are associated with the whistleblowers. It takes a whole team to research and make a responsible report or disclosure. If you only protect the messenger, person who finally delivers the information, the whistleblower is going to be very isolated. And in our experience, isolation is fatal, both to survive professionally and to have an impact, to make a difference. Third thing that's very much needed is an enforcement structure. The law just says that it will be enforced through laws and regulations. That's kind of a truism. Say that about anything. There needs to be specified due process in forum. And I looked at this and thought, this is like a train that's got all the bells and whistles, but it needs its engine. The fourth thing is there needs to be disciplinary sanctions for those who engage in retaliation or don't implement the law. Otherwise, its rights can be defied at will. There has to be standards for the internal channels, protection against conflict of interest, adequate resources, a clear channel of communications to organizational leaders, training for the people who are staffing it. Otherwise, these internal channels are going to become a magnet for cynicism rather than something that employees believe in. And finally, said at the very beginning of this talk, the whistleblowers have to be enfranchised in the corrective action. In Serbia's law, for example, they have to be allowed to participate in the investigation to rebut the denials. Nobody confesses and you investigate. Well, the whistleblowers know how to call those bluffs. They have to be part of the investigation. They should be allowed to comment on the reports of investigation or recommendations if they were adequate. This is the main motivator for whistleblowers to have faith in the system and be willing to risk retaliation. Folks, as I said before, I'm very honored that you invited me to participate in your program. I think Latvia's law is an exciting beachhead. It really needs a second generation to grow up, but it's giving you the resources to turn this right of whistleblowing into something that takes root in your society. And for that, you have my congratulations and my admiration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Devine, for your experience, for your knowledge and all the efforts you have shared regarding whistleblowing. We have a question from auditorium in Zoom chat. Mr. Amit Kabrawala, please. Amit?
Hi,
Yeah.
Tom. Thanks very much for participating, and it's really good to see you and hear from you. I think you've made some really good recommendations. I will certainly work with our colleagues in the Latvian government and also Delna Civil Society to take back some of the recommendations that you've made. I've written them down. And I just cannot thank you enough for participating and lending your expertise. So many of the things you said really hit home for me. So that's all I really wanted to say. Thank you.
I'd like to give Amit credit where due. Not only is he the spark plug for whistleblowing rights in his new post in Latvia, he was kind of like my informal supervisor and a wonderful partner working on whistleblower rights in Serbia. And it shows that there can be very effective partnerships between our country and those in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And so I hope we keep doing that. Sometimes things at the top of our nations are beyond our control, but the public servants inside and outside our country's government are very excited to work with you.
Thank you very much for your support and cooperation. This conference also is all about how we can help each other to understand better and to implement better the protection of whistleblowers. We have also a questions for you, Mr. Devine. One very concrete and straight question: which country has the best whistleblowing law?
Oh, the one that I'm most impressed with is Australia. They had the highest marks, 17 out of 20 best practice criteria. 16 out of, look, I think it was 16 out of 20. The US also has that, but it's a little bit more advanced version of remarks I made on Latvia. So US has lots of bells and whistles, but it's missing some of the fundamentals. The US law doesn't protect against civil or criminal liability. Only employment, only workplace harassment. The US law doesn't give government workers access to court to seek justice and enforce their rights. And those are pretty fundamental. So I think Australia's is better than ours. Tied with Australia, though, and it's a good motivation for you folks, is the EU directive. The EU directive in Australia, I think, set the pace for free speech rights for whistleblowers. And the EU directive is going to be your standard now. So it's a very high bar. And the recommendations that I shared are those that will get you up to the level of the EU directive.
Thank you very much for your answer. One additional question. In your opinion, you mentioned a lot of industries. Are there, and if yes, which are the industries in which the whistleblowing can make the largest impact? Military industry, healthcare, so on?
I don't know if it's the type of industry so much as the scope of the operations. The benefits of whistleblowing and the unfortunate retaliation and reactions to it, in my experience, have been pretty universal. One way to answer your question, though, that could be helpful is looking at the False Claims Act recoveries. Overwhelmingly, it's the healthcare industry in our country where whistleblowers have successfully exposed fraud in government contracts. Our healthcare system seems to be very vulnerable and needs whistleblowers to keep it honest. The second highest, second worst offender, it used to be number one, but the healthcare industry overtook it, is defense contractors. So a lot of waste and corruption in that area. Those are the areas for the False Claims Act. Under the Dodd-Frank law, which Latvians are eligible to make disclosures and get bounties from, that's more the financial sector, and it tends to be the banks and investment consulting banks and those types of operations. That's where the most misconduct seems to happen, is in the financial sector, the defense sector, and the healthcare industry, in our country at least.
Can I ask a question, Tom? I was wondering, given your perspective, what do you think the reluctance is on a lot of the country's parts not to have a whistleblower bounty like we have in the False Claims Act?
Well, I'm very frustrated that there's not False Claims Act in other nations. The bounty, not having bounty provisions makes sense to me because so many countries have, totalitarian roots where um, getting paid to communicate with the government wasn't an act of freedom of speech. It was an act of turning on your neighbors. And whistleblower rights are about freedom of speech. So it kind of confuses the ideals and values to have bounties. But False Claims Act is different. It's not you get paid for whispering in the government's ear like Judas or something. False Claims Act, you have to go and fight and win the battle on behalf of the taxpayers. And it's a partnership between the whistleblower and the government. Both are on the front lines there. I can't really see any grounds for backlash against allowing citizens to defend their country from corruption within, enfranchising that. The government just can't do it all. The False Claims Act by far is our country's most effective anti-corruption statute. And it frustrates me that it hasn't been contagious, that other countries aren't taking advantage of this. This is a far more effective model than just giving money to a whistleblower who talks to the government.
Yes, indeed. It is. Speaking from experience, it is extremely hard work for the whistleblower. It's a full-time job.
Much, Amit, also for an active discussion with Tom. Amit will be also our participant in next discussion, which I will present to you very soon. Thank you, Mr. Devine. We definitely enjoyed your presentation, and I hope you enjoyed this session too. Please stay longer with us to hear also the next discussion.